Well, hello, everybody. My name is Drew McManus, and I'm joined here today with two individuals representing the International Conference. I always get this wrong. Let me pull it up so to make sure I get all the words right. The International Conference of Symphony and Opera Musicians. First up, we have Meredith Snow, who is from the Los Angeles Philharmonic, where she serves as a violist. A native of Long Island, New York, she received her bachelor's and master's degrees from the Juilliard School of Music. Ms. Snow became a member of the Los Angeles Philharmonic in 1986 after 3 years with the San Francisco Opera Orchestra. Fast forward 30 years to 2016, and she was elected chairperson of the International Conference of Symphony and Opera Musicians, which we'll be calling by their acronym ICSOM moving forward.
That about covers it.
That about covers it. Hey, great. And next up, we have Paul Austin. And as an orchestral player, chamber musician, soloist, and pedagogue, Paul Austin currently enjoys a multifaceted career. Paul joined the Grand Rapids Symphony horn section in 1999 and has represented his Grand Rapids Symphony colleagues on many committees, including negotiation, music director, and CEO/president searches, and the Artistic Advisory Committee.
Good morning, Drew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning. Well, terrific. I thank you both for taking the time out of your days. For folks who don't know, Paul's on the East Coast, Meredith is on the West Coast. I'm in Chicago, so we have 3 people in 3 different time zones, which is always fun to arrange schedules. So thanks to everyone for making time. And this is something a little bit new and different for Adaptistration. Usually I'll have an interview with folks like Paul and Meredith, and I'll write all this stuff out into a transcription. But I thought, let's do something a little bit different. Let's have the free-form conversation, record it. I'll upload the whole thing to YouTube, and people will just be able to watch everything kind of unfold in real time. This is much easier than it was 2 or 3 years ago. So thanks to the technology, we're able to actually apply this more real-time sense and feel to let people be more of the conversation, I think. And on that point, today's topic is substitute musician parody. Now, first of all, let's establish what a substitute musician is. Meredith, would be you would say the official description of a substitute orchestral musician?
Well, substitutes and extras. I mean, often enough, you need extra players for a larger piece of repertoire. So you need to add on to what your basic, what's the word? Number is.
Core complement?
Or fill in, fill in for somebody who's absent or not able to make service for whatever reason. So that is a substitute, someone who fills in for somebody that's not there or is extra needed.
And contractually, is there any difference in terminology between a substitute or an extra, or is it just nomenclature that's used, interchangeably?
I guess not. I mean, I think it's just it's a name. What would the difference be contractually? I mean, sometimes if you have an opening that lasts for a year, like somebody's on sabbatical or something, that substitute would be hired for the entire year. But I don't, would you call them a substitute or extra? I don't think it makes any difference.
Paul, anything to add to that?
No, I think they're all covered identically. You can think about the dress code. We don't say the contract musicians wear tuxes and the extras can show up in whatever they wish. So we're on the same boat.
And that's another interesting side rabbit hole of, especially a substitute musician who might play in different ensembles that have different dress codes and having to match and meet them. It's easier for guys. Women have the very short end of the stick on that topic, but we'll have to come back and talk about that at another time. But substitute parody, this, at least inside Adaptistration, became a topic centered around the Minnesota Orchestra work stoppage. That was a season-killing event, the first of its kind in the industry. And at that point in time, everyone was very happy to see a resolution come about and the organization begin to move in a positive direction. But one of the topics that popped up was the final agreement that got the orchestra working again moved the substitute/extra musicians, which we're just going to call substitute moving forward, down off of parity And for folks listening, what parity means is that on a per service, and a service will be a rehearsal or performance typically, is that on a per service level, the substitute musician would be paid the same dollar amount as the core rostered musician if you took that rostered musician's weekly salary and divided it by the number of services in that week, which is usually anywhere from 7 to 9 typically. And so that's how you, from a dollar sense, determine what parity is. You don't throw in everything like the value of benefits or retirement or anything else. That's reserved exclusively for core musicians. So from that sense, Minnesota's agreement actually dropped the substitute from being equal parity down to a lower rate. And ever since that point in time, it's become an increasing issue inside Adaptistration, where we've been examining why that's the case. Now, if a musician in the core ensemble is worth a certain dollar amount, why is the substitute musician worth less?
Well, listen, I don't think that any musician, AFM musician, walks into a negotiation and decides, hey, I'm going to throw my colleagues under the bus so that I can get more money. Nobody's happy about it. But it's not something that, we propose. It's something that management proposes. So you have to work that out at the table. And I think that managements feel that why should they have to pay a musician the same amount of money as somebody who has withstood the trial of fire and earned the job? I don't feel that way. AFM members don't feel that way. We feel that we are equal. But if you're in a negotiation at the 11th hour and management comes in and says, well, we want to do this, and you're either going to go on strike over substitute pay or you're going to accept their proposal, like, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. And I think that, we saw this tendency, this shift. And honestly, Drew, I don't know if it started with the recession or if it was already going on before that. I have no idea. I haven't dug into the statistics to find out what substitute pay looked like before the 2008 recession, because that's sort of where this issue became a problem for us. And other people would go in to negotiate their contracts, musicians and their managements would come and say, well, this is happening in Minnesota and Detroit and New York, wherever. We want to do it too. So how hard are you going to push back? And I think that since we've seen this crisis and said, we have to fix this, we have to make it better. Obviously, ICSOM is not an organization, since our foundation is the right for orchestras to go in and bargain their own contracts, to give them, the power to say, we want to do this. I can't go in and say, hey, you can't do that. They have to work it out themselves. And I think that we have seen orchestras move back in the direction. Now that the economy has recovered, they're not in such a desperate situation. They're definitely trying to make amends for this situation.
And I see Paul has something to add, yeah.
Including Minnesota, because at the end of that unfortunate 16th month lockout, I believe that it was about 90% that it got, the sub and extra pay was down to 90%. But now it's being restored to 100% by the end of this contract, which was a 2017 to 2020. So while that was an unfortunate situation, restoration is in place in Minnesota. Congratulations to them.
It is, and we're going to talk about that in particular coming up as well, too. But Meredith, you mentioned one thing that actually segues perfectly into an item that's related here, is shortly after the Minnesota lockout, the 2016 conference of ICSOM. And for folks who don't know, ICSOM gathers once a year, usually I think it's in August, correct, guys?
Yes.
Yeah. Every August, and all the members will come together and have their annual meeting.
Well, a delegate from each orchestra. So.
Gotcha. And at that particular meeting, there was a resolution adopted, and I'm going to read it here verbatim. So hang on with me while I pull it up. Let's see. Whereas the delegates of the 100th AFM convention in June 2016 adopted resolution number 20, which seeks to achieve equal pay for substitute and extra musicians in salaried orchestra bargaining units, as well as their participation in the bargaining process. And whereas such conditions of unequal pay that currently exist are most often the result of demands by employers against the wishes of the bargaining unit, and whereas substitute and extra musicians are essential to the ongoing operation of any symphony, opera, or ballet orchestra, And whereas there exists no good reason for providing those musicians with any different wage than at least the scale wage upon a pro rata basis, therefore it be resolved that the officers and the delegates of the 2016 ICSOM conference express their unqualified support for all musicians who try to make their living performing the invaluable task of filling temporary vacancies and or adding their talent to certain performances that require a larger ensemble. And be it further resolved that the officers and delegates to the 2016 ICSOM conference call on all orchestral employers to end the exploitation of our short-term brother and sister colleagues by this practice of unequal pay for equal work. Now, I believe both of you were in ICSOM at that time, correct?
Yes.
So you were probably at that meeting, I would assume.
Yeah.
Walk us through a little bit about how that process worked. Where did this come from? How was it introduced? Was there discussion? How did you end up at that final statement?
I believe that resolution was introduced by the governing board. So it's something that, our 9-member governing board would have discussed and put together and put forward for the delegates to vote on. It was unanimous, if I remember correctly. It's going back a couple of years now. But like I said before, nobody thinks we shouldn't pay our extras the same amount that we get paid. We're all part of the same AFM, and we need them as much as, we can't perform without the right number of people. So was there discussion, Paul? I don't even remember. Well, what's to discuss?
Everybody was on board with this. This was in 2016 at our annual. This conference was in Washington, D.C., I remember. And this was an easy resolution to get behind and pass because ICSOM believes 100% in equal pay for subs and extras.
On that point,
there was also a resolution at the American Federation of Musicians Convention that year dealing with the same issue, and it was introduced by 2 former ICSOM chairs, Brad Buckley and Robert Levine. And they had tried actually to legislate the amount of money, to make it law that subs and extras would be paid extra. But again, it's just not possible to go into each contract individually and dictate what's going to happen at the bargaining table. It can't happen. But I can promise you that the intention nationwide is to bring parity.
And I'm glad you mentioned Robert, actually, because at the time when Minnesota was out, Robert was, longtime viewers and readers will know this, but Robert was one of the only guys that actually came on, and we went on a different show, actually, and discussed this topic at great length, and where things were right in the heat of it at the time. I think we even were having that done before the settlement came about. And so it was still a pretty hot topic. At that point in time. And for folks who also don't know Brad Buckley, Brad is what I would call a first generation kind of cold warrior.
He's a great historian, Robert. And so it would be interesting to sort of dig back into the history of this and find out if Minnesota is the first crack in the wall. I have no idea.
Well, and that would be fascinating to find out what was the case with the ratio between orchestras that do and don't pay substitute parity before the economic meltdown of 07, 08? Because the numbers I have, the most recent ones, were what I gathered from 2014, which was in the middle of the Minnesota dispute. Yeah. And at that point in time, there were 64% of the ICSOM orchestras at that point in time, and just symphonic orchestras, I didn't count ballet orchestras or opera orchestras, but 64% did not have parity, and 36% did. So about 2/3, 1/3 ratio between the two. I have not looked at the numbers since then. I don't know if ICSOM has been tracking that, but are you guys aware of any difference?
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Paul.
In the right direction. For example, the Florida Orchestra in 2016, they have moved from their subs and extras being paid about 88% to a full 100%. And so they did that by getting to the subs back to that full scale. It was a result of the contract musicians taking a fairly modest salary increase to be able to do that. It was something that they believed in, they preserved. Grand Rapids Symphony is another one. I'm proud to say that in our 2015 negotiation that we now have the same amount for the sub and extra players as we do the contract players. I know when I first started bargaining in Grand Rapids Symphony back, I think 2001 was my first time, the AFM takes a look at your contract and sort of gives you pointers about this needs improvement. And the first thing they said was your sub rate needs to be up to the contract musician rate. And every contract we inched up, got closer. And in 2015, we're there now. Alabama Symphony as well. They have come up to that. Indianapolis has progressed. They've moved from 80% of scale to 85%. Milwaukee, I believe, has moved up as well. Oregon Symphony, Pittsburgh Symphony, which was really interesting because that was a time in Pittsburgh when the contract musicians took a salary cut and gave up the pension, but they restored full pay for the subs and extras. So, I mean, there has been movement, and probably that list needs to be updated. We might be able to work on that with you, Drew. To be able to.
That'd be great, actually. And interestingly enough, in 2014, I don't think Grand Rapids and Florida were actually members of ICSOM yet, were they?
Florida was a member of ICSOM.
Florida.
Not Grand Rapids. Yeah.
But not Grand Rapids. Yeah, the others definitely were.
In 2013, Grand Rapids joined, so maybe we hadn't migrated over to the other list.
Well, and this would be a fascinating thing to start to drill down into those groups that have actually had a change, moving from non-parity to parity, to see what happened in those particular negotiations, to be able to actually begin to move them into that new direction. Because I think you had mentioned, was it Indianapolis or Pittsburgh? You said that actually took a bit of a zero-sum approach to it and adjusted their own potential increases to balance out that parity amount. Is that Pittsburgh, you said?
Yes.
That's what sure.
Yeah. Because at the time in Minnesota, and this is one of the things that actually was the center of Roberts and I's discussion at that point in time, was in the, it was 6-year agreement that Minnesota signed, which started 2014-15 season and goes through the 19-20 season. That's the agreement, Paul, you were referencing, that at the end of that agreement, substitutes come back up to parity.
Yes.
And crunching the numbers and being very conservative, on the favor of more than less, I calculated it would have cost every rostered court musician in Minnesota about $2,599.48 a year for each of the years in that contract to maintain parity. And that's now the next discussion. Is obviously in a situation like that with Minnesota, they've been out a year. There were a substantial amount of pressure on getting something solved, and whether or not this item actually rose to the level of them doing that math and making those considerations, I don't know. I've reached out to talk to them about that over the years, but they haven't been willing to do that. But Pittsburgh is something that sounds like it falls more into that category. Even though, Meredith, you pointed out something I think that's good for for viewers and readers to know, which is, ICSOM's not like a big old school top down, flight attendant, where you're telling people what to do.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you certainly can't influence and encourage.
Yes, absolutely. And we have, and I think it's made a difference. I mean, a lot of what goes on in a negotiation is something that nobody knows about what happened in there. So because the negotiating committee doesn't talk about it, and you can assume that management is going to go after every penny that they can, because that's what they do. And we do the opposite on the other end. I think that, when you step back in a negotiation and you lose some sort of pay or benefits, it's frustrating that it takes such a long time to get back to where you were. Often if you just grind out 1% or 2% a year, and it can take you 2 or 3 contract negotiations or more to get back up to where you were. So this progress is going to be very slow in terms of getting parity for substitutes. It's going to take several contract rounds as opposed to just doing it instantly. And I think that everybody feels the frustration in that. I know, in Los Angeles, I think during the recession, we probably went down to about 85% on subpay. I forget exactly the number. It might have been 82, but we're going to be at the end of this contract now, we'll be up to 90%, but it also includes health and welfare. So there's another issue where, a lot of managements are not paying the benefits on the subpay. All we can do is keep asking and keep pushing that issue. But we can't tell them.
Sure. That's really interesting, because that's reminds me of something I remember sure to mention to you, Drew, is that the North Carolina Symphony, while the subs and extras are paid 85% of the base pay, they do have some language in their contract that says and protects some of the things that sometimes can be frustrating to a substitute musician, is when all of a sudden the schedule changes a few weeks before and you're juggling calendars between different orchestras. Well, North Carolina, they have a provision now in their contract that, as a result of their 2016 negotiation, that said substitute and extra musicians, once engaged, will receive full payment for any canceled services that occur within 2 weeks of the first service of the set of services. Any services canceled between 2 and 4 weeks prior to the first service of the set of services will be paid 50% for each canceled service. So while we are talking about the pay, we're also talking about some protections that I think is very wise.
And those are also additionally wonderful rabbit holes to jump into that sometimes can differ greatly inside a contract. Opera orchestras, I know there are a few that have issues with additional protections for substitute musicians, because in those cases, it's not uncommon for a substitute to be called with as little as 45 minutes or an hour before the show starts, and having never attended any of the rehearsals.
Yeah.
So do you want the conductor or music director to be able to say never hire that person again based on that one time? Well, and if the music director or conductor is oblivious of this fact, yes, those are the sorts of things I think people would find particularly fascinating with how much nuance.
Yeah, that's my story in Grand Rapids. I auditioned to be a substitute extra player, and the next night at 7:00, the phone rang and said, "We need you here in an hour for a televised concert of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony." And I lived an hour away. Drove incredibly fast, hooked on the sidewalk, raced on stage, did the piece, and saved the day. And for 5 years before I won the job in Grand Rapids, I was a sub player. So I do understand completely the life of substitute musicians, and do understand that this topic is very, very important. And I'm glad that ICSOM has addressed this with a resolution. We're behind this 100%, that while we're not quite there, we are moving in the right direction, and we want to continue to support that in the future.
Well, getting back to the ICSOM element of this, what specific programs, what's ICSOM doing when it reaches out and talks to its member committees, its delegates, to begin to address the awareness issue and then suggest particular courses of action?
Well, I don't think that there's anybody that is not aware of the unfairness of the situation. And do they need to be reminded when they go in to negotiate? I don't think so. I mean, everybody knows that it's going on and that it's not just. And so, you deal with it when you get to a negotiation, because there's no other way to do that. And there are a million factors that go into decisions that are made at the negotiation table. And so you do the best you can. And I applaud Pittsburgh, for making that sacrifice for their substitutes. I don't know how you just keep trying.
Yeah. And the AFM does a good job of that. They encourage their locals and their orchestra committees when they go in negotiations to try to bargain to equalize the pay rates. And of course, ICSOM supports that. We supported it with the resolution. Everyone knows that that's our stand, and we'll continue.
Right. And I mean, the AFM is the only organization that actually has teeth when it comes to a negotiation and can say, no, you can't do that, or we don't accept that. So it's not like ICSOM can make a negotiation committee change their mind, but the AFM can.
Do you track information? Because there's a couple of statements that are going around, and this wouldn't be Adaptistration if there weren't some hard questions. But when you say that everybody presents this in their negotiation about reducing any kind of pay disparity, do you quantify or track the proposals to know for a fact that it is something?
We can't. We cannot know what goes on inside a negotiation. It's privileged information. I mean, we can talk to them when they come out or when it's signed, or talk to the local and say, so what happened in there? But it's private.
In any of the workshop sessions at ICSOM, which I haven't been to a conference in several years, so I assume they still have those. In any of the workshop sessions, have there been any that are focused on substitute-oriented issues, whether it be disparity or work rule-related issues?
The thing is that in those sessions, while this is an important topic, we also have to talk about healthcare. Think about pension payments. So while sub pay is important and we are behind it, that it should be the same as a contracted musician, there are huge topics in those areas that we really, really address.
What would you say besides you need to make this equal? I don't know what there is to talk about.
Well, Ed, that's probably one of those next hard questions, which is it's very clear in the resolution that ICSOM passed that this is something that is placed squarely on the employer's side of the table. The employers are the ones who are being intransient. They're not agreeing to substitute pay, and here are all the reasons they list, and we don't agree with those. And the presentation that there's then nothing else to do besides negotiating about it does leave out one very, very powerful tool at any negotiation committees and memberships toolkit, which is they can walk out.
Yes.
Let's take an empathy-driven approach to it, and let's say that the management was going to insist that the tuba player and the contrabassoon player were now going to earn 90% of what the base scale of everyone else was. And granted, this is a hypothetical, so we don't know. But
so you're talking about a contract player, not a substitute player.
A contract player, right. And if the management wanted to use the same rationale as with a substitute, because you either agree with the rationale or you don't. So if you don't, they can pretty much say whatever they want to justify any kind of pay scale. But let's say that they wanted to do that for two core members and say, now we want to pay them 90%. Is that something then that the membership would probably walk out and go on strike over?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's dependent on every situation and every group of people. And it certainly is philosophically and ideologically, it would be wonderful to say yes. But I can't say.
What would you tell? Let's say you're at one of those orchestras that's on the list that doesn't have parity. What would you tell a substitute in your orchestra that I would be willing to go out on strike or I wouldn't be willing to go out on strike?
You mean me personally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah.
Me personally, yes. I think it's a strikeable issue, but I hesitate to advise anyone to go on strike because it does a lot of violence and blood is shed, and it's really hard to get back to where you were after a work action. So there hopefully are other ways to horse trade and make it happen. And unfortunately, I think that the horse trading route is much slower. It just takes a longer amount of time to squeeze the pennies out of management and make people understand that. What's worth what, and how do you decide which direction you're going to go in? So, I mean, I look at my own orchestra and I think it's inexcusable with all the money that we have that we're not paying our subs the full amount. Why would that be? But it's because management stands on that. In principle, they don't want to have to pay extras the same amount that they pay the contract players. So, yeah, how hard are you going to push?
But don't you have extra players who get a health and welfare payment? Or?
Everybody gets health and welfare and pension benefit and all that, but it's still not 100% of base. It's 90% at the end of the contract. So I don't know. I'm one of 100 people, and I can say what I want in that orchestra, but it doesn't mean that everybody else is going to agree.
Right. And with that question, that is Paul and Meredith speaking. You're not speaking on behalf of your organizations nor ICSOM, because that is a very personal question that only individual musicians can answer. themselves who are in it. But the one benefit that I have in this position is I get to hear from a lot of musicians that are both core musicians and substitute musicians. And for folks who are also not familiar with how this structure between core and substitute musicians work, is only the rostered core musicians are allowed to vote on ratification of a contract. Substitute musicians are not allowed to vote. They can have input. Sometimes it's zero. Sometimes committees don't want any input from substitute musicians. Sometimes the local might act as an intermediary between them. But the substitutes are basically at whatever position that their colleagues that are in the core want to vote on. So from that aspect, they don't have that sort of influence or pressure. They are definitely on the outside looking in. And they're in the very tenuous position of, if you push too hard, then you risk potentially being hired for future services. That's where being the squeaky wheel becomes a very tenuous position.
Yeah, their firewall is the AFM. It's the local that determines. I mean, because ultimately the contract is signed between management and the local, and so the local is in a position to say this is not acceptable and send them back to the table, and make them change their minds, everybody that's at the negotiating table. So it's not like fair, and we're doing the best that we can to make it fair. But I don't know what you can do besides encourage, exhort, educate, make people understand that this is an unjust situation, and just keep chipping away at it, Your
colleague, Robert Levine, had some interesting ideas, and something that I tend to gravitate toward myself, which is in that structure, since the substitutes don't have the ability to vote directly on a contract, the local can approach the employer and negotiate a separate collective bargaining agreement on behalf of the substitutes.
Yeah, the Met has that. I think that
the Met, they're the only, right, the Met Opera Orchestra, right. Yeah, and that even itself has an unusual history that had nothing to do with the impetus of why that contract actually started the way it was.
Yeah.
It in and of itself would be another fascinating conversation. But there is no local that actually takes upon themselves the responsibility to then change any sort of disparity. None that I've actually known before. And of the 13 that I asked around the Minnesota Orchestra lockout, none of the local presidents want to talk about it.
Right. Well, I think that you would get into a very difficult political situation, in a sense, with if you would be giving subs their own separate contract, you would then wind up with two separate orchestras. And I don't know that there's any administration that would agree to carry, it's an issue in Los Angeles because we have the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra and we have the Los Angeles Philharmonic. They're both under the same association. They make completely different pay scales and, different number of guaranteed services and all that. And it is a source of contention. It's difficult, but is the local going to go in and say, make this equal? How could they? Again, it comes down to individual negotiations each time you go in to talk about it. You have to try to push the barriers.
I agree with Meredith completely on this. I mean, if we're saying that everything should be 100% equal between the subs and extras with the contract musicians as far as pay, that also goes for work rule conditions, when to show up for work, how much of an intermission you're going to have, how much of a break you get, what you wear. It's all the same. So if we're going to be the same, why would we want to have separation for contracts?
It then comes down to time frame. We started, when I say we, on the Adaptistration end of things, started examining this issue in great detail back in 2014, and it's now 2019. And where do we go moving forward, since we're still not even at the 50-50 mark yet? If you're the substitutes in those markets where they're being paid less, and to them, this just keeps grinding on. There are substitutes who will play for most of their careers and not reach parity. at what point does there need to be more of a stick poking going on to move their colleagues in a direction where they're willing to get that parity moving faster than not?
It's gosh, there are so many strata to this conversation. I don't, when you say 50-50, I don't know that we ever were in a position where all the ICSOM orchestras paid their substitutes an equal amount. So I don't know, how that percentage compares what's going on now to what's going on before. And you also have, the black box of principal pay. And there's so many stressors on the amount of money that's available to pay people. You've got music directors scooping millions of dollars off the top of that nonprofit, and CEOs, in a very capitalist style, which hopefully the unions would be a socialist organization, but you're still trying to superimpose that on top of a very capitalist society. And there's, to sort of impose the equality issue, which I think should be there by all means for subs. But we're fighting a lot of history, and we're fighting a lot of resistance. And again, you say, well, go out on strike, make it equal. And I don't recommend that anybody go out on strike. Unless you absolutely have to, unless there's no way, because I think that it's incredibly destructive. Mm-hmm. I mean, Los Angeles, again, is a situation very unusual because we have a lot of money, but we also have never had a work action since 1968. That's the last time the orchestra went out. So we have a long history of cooperation and trying to work things out together. And, it's not always happy, but we don't go to war. So, and I hope it stays that way.
You brought up the executive compensation, because Drew, I think that was a topic at Adaptistration recently, wasn't it?
We hit that every year pretty hard, yeah.
Apologies for smiling while Meredith was talking about that, but I know that was something close to your heart when we brought that up. I agree. I would really like to maybe have an email between us to follow up on that list, because I'm pretty sure the movement is going in the right direction with ICSOM's orchestras as far as the 100% sub extra pay to match the contract musicians. Are we there yet? No, but we are moving there. We're promoting it. We continue to let people know that this is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should put Robert Levine on the forensics of the history before 2014 and see what things look like.
I'm sure he'll be thrilled that you volunteered him for that.
He doesn't have enough to do.
I can feel it coming down from Milwaukee right now. Yes. But he would be an excellent person, I think, yes, to be able to dig up the history for that. Because I do think that would be a good byproduct of this conversation, not just to update that list from 2014, but also see historically how far back this goes. Sure. Paul, any last thoughts?
I support Meredith.
That's why you voted for me, right?
Exactly. Well, I continue to. I'm glad that we had a chance to speak about this today, Drew. Really, I think it's an important topic. As I said, I had a life as a sub-extra musician. For a while, I juggled 4 or 5 orchestras at the same time with their calendars and try to make everything jive together the best I can. We are moving in the right direction. I do want an updated list. Mm-hmm. Look at that, and I think they were updating it from 5 years ago or so. It'd be nice to see that needle move in the right direction. That I'm
wholeheartedly agree. I think that's a great suggestion. And folks, I'm sure who are watching this will be able to look forward to that in the next couple of months, at least, being able to, and then tracking this moving forward, I think would be a great thing to do as well. Now, to that end, I will say, again, I can't give my thanks enough to both Paul and Meredith for being here. Because in addition to all the local officers that I contacted during the Minnesota lockout time, I also contacted the ICSOM leadership to come on and have this same kind of conversation, although not recorded, but something in written form. And they at first said, no, thank you, and then simply stopped replying to requests entirely. So I am extremely grateful that you're taking the time to address this at times very difficult and touchy subject. And I do appreciate that very much.
I'm happy to talk about it. As long as you don't talk about it during a negotiation, you're in good stead.
I will keep that in mind, and we will try to avoid it. But I think, Paul, you guys are good to go in your orchestra. You are at parity.
We are. We're in such a good place right now. We have a new music director. We have a new president CEO. And this is the right time. Perfect storm in a good way.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you both very much for being here. I appreciate your time, and we'll hopefully make this more of an ongoing thing. We'll talk to more folks like Paul and Meredith across both the AFM, and starting to talk to managers, board members, and other movers and shakers in the field. So thanks to everybody for taking your time out to give us a listen. Thanks.
Great. Bye-bye. Thank you, Drew.